So, now is the time to reveal the winner of the 2020 Booker Prize. My very astute co-judges and I have chosen an outstanding winner, and that is Shuggie Bain by Douglas Stuart.
There it is. Thank you very much, Margaret Busby, Chair of the Judge. The winner of the 2020 Booker Prize is Douglas Stuart for Shuggie Bain. Douglas, I know you're looking absolutely shocked there. Let me just invite you just to say a few words, a speech.
Oh, sorry, I'm absolutely stunned. I didn't expect that at all. I'd like to, first of all, just thank my mother. I think I've been clear that my mother is in every page of this book, and without her, I wouldn't be here, and my work wouldn't be here. I'd like to thank
Hello and welcome to the Booker Prize podcast with me, James Walton.
And me, Jo Hamier. And today we're bringing you a Burns Night special in honour of any Scots who may be dancing the ceilidh or eating haggis. Now, James, I realise that you are the quizmaster out of the two of us, but I'd like to turn the tables on you.
Oh, lorks. This is not set up that you told me I had a mystery intro.
Yep.
Okay.
It's only for a moment and I'm sure you'll love it. So, a wise man once said of our chosen book for today that this is an overwhelmingly vivid novel. It is not just an almost eerily accomplished debut, it also feels like a moving act of filial reverence, if not perhaps of the sort that J.M. Barrie would have recognised. 10 points. Can you tell me which writer that's from?
Oh, bless you, Joe. That was me in one of my starrier capacities, which is reviewing for the New York Review of Books.
Exactly. And 5 more points. Can you tell me which book?
Yes. The book was Shuggie Bain by Douglas Stuart. I think I'll talk a bit more about how that review came about and what I learned from it maybe later on. But thank you for that, Joe.
You're welcome. So yes, we will come to Shuggie Bain and your review, but just for the moment, perhaps we should first explain to our more global audience what Burns Night actually is.
I can't claim to be a big expert on this, but it is a commemoration of, it's the 25th of January every year, which is by coincidence today, and it is a commemoration of Scotland's national poet, who is Rabbie Burns.
Yeah.
I think haggis is piped in. There's sort of ceremonial dinner, quite a lot of neeps and tatties and whiskey, I believe. Obviously, we're doing Shuggie Bain for Burns Night because Douglas Stuart is Scottish, and in fact, he was only the second Scottish winner of the Booker Prize after James Kelman, who won in 1994 for How Late It Was, How Late.
So we should move on to a summary of Shuggie Bain and the context in which it won.
Now, the context in which it won was a rather melancholy ceremony. It's available online. Booker Prize website, obviously, because it was during lockdown 2020.
Yeah.
So you had the sort of listees sort of waving rather forlornly from the sofas. There's a little speech from Barack Obama, and John Wilson, who was the presenter, sort of interviewing people. Margaret Busby, who's the chair of judges, and Bernardine Everista, who's the reigning champ. There was also an interview with Kazuo Ishiguro, rather interesting, because he was saying there's 3 stages. There's the long list, there's a short list, and then there's the announcement of the winner. But he said actually the most important stage is what comes next, which is will the public take this book to their hearts? And in the case of Shuggie Bain, the answer was an unbelievably resounding yes. It sold around 1.5 million copies. And much to Douglas Stuart's delight, Barrowlands in Glasgow, which is one of the great music venues there, now has a sort of mural of Shuggie and a quote from the book. Oh. So I think Douglas Stuart's become an all-round Glaswegian and Scottish hero, even though it's something we might return to. He lives in New York.
As you say, James, 2020, and the other shortlisted novels for that year, some of which I feel like by authors who have really kind of become like a new generation of writers. Burnt Sugar by Avni Doshi and Real Life by Brandon Taylor, who is now like a kind of giant, at least on social media. Also, The New Wilderness by Diane Cook, This Mournable Body by Tsutsi Dangarembwa, and The Shadow King by Marza Mengistu. Douglas Stuart himself was born in 1976 in Sighthill, which is a housing estate in Glasgow in Scotland. I think for anyone who's read Shuggie Bain, you'll hear echoes, if not sort of direct kind of parallels between the book and Stuart's biographies. The youngest of 3 siblings, his father left his family when Stuart was quite young, and he was raised by a single mother who was battling alcoholism and addiction, and she died due to health-related issues when he was 16. There's this really interesting bit in a Guardian interview that he did for his latest novel, Young Mungo, which pretty much sounds like a partial plot outline for the novel itself. The interview goes, "The way he speaks is largely down to his mother. She was a proud woman who insisted that he spoke the Queen's English. She thought regional accents would hold back your kids, that if you wanted to do well, you had to talk like a BBC newscaster. So as a kid, I sounded a bit weirder than the kids around me." Did they bully him for the way he spoke? He laughs. "They hardly needed that as an excuse," he says. "From the age of 6, they taunted him. They thought I was queer because I liked dolls, My Little Pony, and singing and dancing, and if you gave me a bit of space, I'd twirl. But actually, the reason they thought I was gay is because I didn't play football. Every day somebody would call me a puffy wee bastard." I can't say that with a straight face. I don't think people insult each other that way anymore. They would call me a puffy wee bastard. I didn't quite know what they meant, but I knew I should feel ashamed about it. And so he goes on to talk about the fact that, by the time that he was sort of a preteen, he was already an adult in the house. His brother and sister left home fairly early on when they were 15 and 16 respectively. He would undress his mother when she was too drunk to do it herself, brush her hair, make sure she was eating enough, try and protect her from abuse and gossip. And he does say that he would have never been able to write Shuggie Bain if his mother hadn't died. At age 24, Stuart, as you say, James, moved to New York to begin a career in fashion design, where he worked first for Calvin Klein and then Ralph Lauren, and then for Banana Republic as a senior director of design. And he began writing Shuggie Bain while he was balancing 12-hour shifts at Banana Republic. Hilariously enough, I was thinking about this, and probably around the time that Stuart was at Banana Republic, I was a teenager in the United States, and I really liked shopping dragging my parents to Banana Republic to let me browse around and shop. So possibly I did wear clothes that Douglas Stuart had designed as a teenager, which is quite hilarious to think of now.
It is an amazing story how he got from there to there. Because he'd been looking after his mother, his schooling was more or less neglected. There was 2 arts teachers who rated him highly, and they persuaded him to go to first of all, he went to Scottish College of Textiles, I believe, where he was the only boy. Then he went to London to the Royal College of Art to do fashion. And his graduate show, there was fashion scouts there, and one of them was from Calvin Klein, who said, "Would you like to come and work in New York?"
That's lovely. Well, he still lives in the East Village, and that seems to be in the tradition of Scottish writers who seem to write in homage to a country they really don't want to live in.
Careful on Burns night, but we will come back to that.
And with his husband, I believe. So, doing really well. And I think his second novel, Young Mungo, is also like a bestseller. Yeah. So, well done, Douglas Stuart. Not that you really need it from me, but nice one, man.
So Shuggie Bain, it opens in 1992 in a bedsit, where Shuggie is living alone, working in a supermarket and sort of going to school a bit. Actually, that opening section is a rather brilliant overture, actually, because almost all the themes of the book are sort of foreshadowed. But then we flash back to his childhood from the age of 5 when he was in Sighthill, and his mum Agnes, which was also the name of Stuart's own mother. So
really?
it is an autobiographical novel. There's no 2 ways about it. He hasn't really hidden that. His dad, Big Shug, is a taxi driver and all-round villain, and living with his grandparents, who are Agnes's parents, Wally and Lizzie. It's also a time of full-on Thatcherism, where Glasgow is basically collapsing. All the heavy industry is going.
Yeah.
In the opening scene, there's women playing cards together, including Agnes, and they talk about that. They've got men back at home rotting into sofas for want of work. Agnes, had been married before to a sort of rather unexciting, but looking back at it, not a bad choice. But she leaves him because she's rather dazzled by Big Shug, this glamorous Protestant guy, and she says she wanted, I thought I could do better. And his mother says to her, Lizzie says to her, "Well, look what Better's got you. Better's got him Big Shug, who is
a cad."
Yeah, he really is poisonous in a way that we may return to. Big Shug, after a while, takes the family to Pithead, which is meant to be a new start. It's a sort of housing development by a coal mine, but actually coal mine's already closed. The men there have got no work. Big Shug, as soon as they get there, more or less, leaves. The house is much smaller and much more horrible than he'd let on. The neighbours don't like the Baines very much. And once Shug leaves, Agnes really turns to the booze then. And she spends most of her benefits on it. And when that runs out, she sleeps with a local husband or two in return for booze. Older sister Catherine leaves more or less as soon as she can.
Yeah.
They are slightly closer in age to Shuggy than his own brother and sister were to Douglas Stuart. And his brother Leek is actually apparently Stuart's favourite character in the book, but he seems to opt out, but he sort of keeps an eye on Agnes and on Shuggy. But it's mainly him who undresses her, as in the way he describes doing with his own mother. Quite a famous scene now, I think, where he will leave out a glass of water for her and a glass of milk. This is so that she can have it in the morning, and also the remains of the special brew, and he knows which one she will
Not
turn
even
to
just
first.
the remains of the special brew, it's like any booze he can scrape from around the
that's
house
true,
mixed into this weird cocktail
that's
to ward off the kind of shakes she gets from
that's
withdrawal.
what she'll do first. Meanwhile, he's, again, in the autobiographical way you suggest, he's bullied for being effeminate and longs to be normal. And that continues to be the two main narratives, really. But especially Agnes, whom Shuggy unavailingly tries to help, keeps trying to help, will not give up. He's always impressed by her resilience and her pride, the way she always dresses well and the fact that she looks beautiful. And they're both convinced that she's superior to the people around her, which we will discuss whether they're right to think that. But then she does rather unexpectedly sober up for at one point. She goes to AA. She decides to go into a slightly further into town, so it would have a better class of alcoholic. she slightly posher AA, which does the trick. And she gets a job. She works in a garage at night, so keep her off the booze at nights. She gets a man named Eugene. And
we hate Eugene.
Oh, I don't.
You don't?
No,
I do.
Okay, and she starts properly looking after Shuggy, cooking for him, having fun with him. But that's not necessarily going to last, as that biography that you gave us of Douglas Stuart himself suggests. And I suppose I better leave it there.
Yeah.
So that's what happens in Shuggie Bain. So what do you reckon, Jo?
Well, I think the typical response to this book is to cry, and I feel like Stuart did intend for it to be a tearjerker. And I do think that Agnes's good year, her sober year that you refer to, is actually quite some might say mean, and I would say odd trick on Stuart's behalf, because it comes slap bang in the middle of the book. I think by that point, it's like miserable all the way through, but by that point you're sort of like, okay, well, I get that this is a book about poverty and abuse and addiction, and it's just awful. I mean, you're pretty much just constantly reading about Agnes being slapped around or her being hung over, sort of publicly humiliated and embarrassed, her kids who are just like alternately hungry or missing out on school, and I feel like the first sort of how many sort of 200-ish pages of that is enough to kind of reflect on. But then all of a sudden it's like Stuart kind of thinks, oh, people must be getting fatigued with this now. I feel like he knows that he wouldn't blame people for putting the book down at that point, but he does want to keep going with the misery. So he slots in these 50 pages where Agnes is suddenly a good mother and healthy and well, just so you can kind of get through the other 200 pages of absolute misery. And I feel like those final 200 pages is where I got a bit impatient. But what did you think?
I loved it, actually. I think it deserves all the... Well, I think it absolutely deserves all the success it's had. I do agree with you to the extent that I think it's been slightly sanitized since, because it's been such a huge hit, because he's now the sort of king of Glasgow. It was quite interesting to see him being interviewed by Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, as she then was at the Edinburgh Book Festival, and she sort of welcomes him home and gets a massive applause from all of Scotland. And she talks about it as a book that it removes the stigma around addiction, that it gives voice to the voiceless, that it's a love letter to Glasgow. And I just think it is a lot darker and spikier and angrier and more interesting than that. But in a way, Douglas Stuart's sort of gone along with this mythology a bit. I think he sort of seems to be suggesting in interviews that it's basically a tender portrait of his lovely tragic mother, which it is. But it is a tender portrait. I did feel for Agnes. You do feel for Agnes, but it's not just tender. It's also all those other things: grief-stricken, excruciating at times, unsparing, piercing, heartbroken, guilt-laden. And another thing that I think in its sort of its posthumous sentimentalization in a way, is that the people who interview him now say, do you think your mother would be proud of this book interview? And the answer to that is yeah. She'd be very proud I won the book with this book. Actually, wouldn't she be mortified by the picture of her in this book? So, in a way, I think it's a lot more interesting and I still would suggest brilliant than the slightly sanitized myth that's beginning to grow up around it would suggest.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think this idea of the best reaction you could have in response to this novel is to cry is deeply weird to me for so many reasons. I actually felt a profound sense of anger towards a lot of the characters, Agnes primarily, because essentially you are reading about a woman who, despite her sort of better angels, is just an extremely neglectful mother. So in your summary, you mentioned that she was married before she ran off with Hugh Bain, but I don't think it sort of quite underlines how foolish Agnes can be. So her first husband is this perfectly gentle, generous, nice man who wants to give her the world, who works extra shifts to be able to afford a mink coat for her so that she can like sort of fulfill her image of herself as like a Glasgow Liz Taylor, who, when she steals away with his children in the middle of the night with some random cab driver, he doesn't go, oh, well, I'm done with her, she's a terrible woman. He goes, oh my God, what did I do wrong? Well, tell me how I can change and then we can go back to being a family. And even when she divorces him, he goes, we could get married again. Just tell me what I need to do. Do you need more stuff, more clothes, a better house? I'll do it. And she keeps saying no because she wants a bad boy. And it's only until one day he's with his daughter, Catherine, and she introduces herself as a stranger. Introduces herself to a stranger as Catherine Bain rather than Catherine McGowan, is it? Yeah, rather than Catherine McGowan, that he realizes, oh, I've really lost my family here. I need to walk away. But I don't see how you could cry at something like that. That is deeply, irritating is a gentle word. The feelings you get towards Agnes of like, why are you wasting your life and more importantly the life of your children for this guy who beats you, rapes you, ditches you in like a new build housing estate? And when you ask him, why did you never come back? He says, oh, I just wanted to see if you'd stay there, or whether you'd actually leave me.
But what about this idea that she has of herself and Shuggy has of her? And in fact, the people who read the book now, that there is something sort of glorious about her. This is a bit that people tend to quote quite a lot, actually. Shuggy understood that this was where she excelled. Every day with the makeup on and her hair done, she climbed out of the grave and held her head high. When she had disgraced herself with drink, she got up next day, put on her best coat, and faced the world. And she does consider herself superior to the people around her. But the thing is, people tend to quote that bit, but they don't tend to quote this bit, which is when one of the neighbours says to her, you're joking, right? This is Colleen. You come here to our wee scheme thinking you're some kind of big I am, walking around thinking you're better than the rest of us with your hairspray and your handbag there. She thrust her finger at Agnes. Ye and that funny wee boy try and rub our noses in it, and the whole time ye's a lying in your own piss and blank blank other women's men. Lord, I've never seen such a hypocrite. And again, I think what I think about this book, I think, is astonishing level of contradictions that are allowed to coexist and to all be true. Okay, for example, so you got the tragic and the funny, the unsparing, the tender, the compassionate, the excruciating, all in the book, often in the same paragraph, or certainly the same. Well, it consists of individual vignettes, really. The book,
yeah, it does.
So there's one bit where Colleen, that same woman,
sister of Eugene,
yes, as it turns out,
eventually dates.
Yeah, that's right. At one point, Agnes sleeps with Colleen's husband, Jamesy, so that he will take Shug fishing. Yeah. Because that show him give him sort of a male role model. Jamesy sleeps with her, but then doesn't take him fishing. She decides to tell Colleen about this, that she slept with Jamesy, gets just drunk enough to do it well, to have the courage to do it, but not to be completely terrible. Meanwhile, a posh woman comes round to Colleen's and says she's been sleeping with Jamesy. Colleen throws Jamesy out, comes out sort of completely distressed, falls on the floor, sort of thrashing about, has got no pants on, no knickers. And the quite drunk Agnes takes off her own knickers and gives them to Colleen. Now, this is a scene that I think is, as I say, it's all of those things. It's excruciating, it's funny, it's tender, there's unbelievable control of tone for most of the time. As I say, I think you can do all those in one sentence sometimes. So that bit where she decides to join AA, but in a posher part of Glasgow, sentence is, it was a fresh start, she had thought, and hopefully a better class of alcoholic.
Yeah. No, you're winning me round slightly. I think...
And those bits, as I say, now we're meant to think Agnes is this unbelievably glorious figure, which she sort of semi is, but that belief that she's better than the people around her, it's partly based on the fact that she's more beautiful. On the one hand, glorious and fantastic, and on the other, sad and delusional.
Yeah, no, I'll give you that. Perhaps my issue is more with sort of reader reactions than it is with the actual book. I will say that sort of come back to my earlier point and flesh it out a little bit. I sometimes felt while reading that although Shuggy is a child for a lot of this book, I found him a bit too devoted. The only time where Shuggy in any way sort of rebels is, I think, when he's around the age of 15 or 16 and Agnes has spent all of their benefits on booze and again and meanwhile, and on the presumption sort of that he's getting hot meals at school, so he has at least one hot meal a day, and yet blithely unaware of the fact that Shuggy's been horrendously bullied at school, so people are taking away his lunch vouchers, and so he hasn't been eating at all, and that's the only point at which he puts up any kind of, not necessarily even fight, but just like questions her at all, you know. And that seems sort of surprising to me, especially because there are two other kids, his siblings in this book, Catherine and Leek, who have a much more, you know, maybe in the logic of this book, by virtue of being older, clear-sighted view of their mother. So Catherine absconds to apartheid South Africa to kind of take part in another form of kind of abuse and oppression, but just one where she happens to financially profit. And Leek is sort of very, I mean, he eventually gets kicked out by Agnes just for saying, you know, what the hell are you doing? You're a drunk, you know, get it together. There's this bit which I think a lot of people find really touching, but that I just really do find a bit, I know that part of Shuggy's character is that he's meant to, you know, as Douglas says of his own childhood, speak the Queen's English and be very proper, and that's why he's sort of ostracised from...
She corrects him from saying a boot to say about. Yeah.
But there's this bit where Agnes and Shuggy are in the hospital because Agnes's father is dying, and Shuggy hears a nurse say to a male attendant that she thinks Agnes is a working girl, i.e. a prostitute, and Shuggy goes, "She is not. My mother has never worked a day in her life. She's far too good looking for that." You know, it's funny, but then I'm a bit like, does this kid really say this? Like, and especially in context of the fact that he's perpetually sort of going cold and hungry. Like, there are all these repeated mentions of his thighs being blue, of the bath water being lukewarm at best.
There are a lot of blue thighs in the book.
Yeah, of the meter above the TV that's filled with 50p coins only having enough to watch, you know, about 3 hours of TV, and that's a luxury. You know, would you not, even as a like 8-year-old, complain?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it does sort of play Shuggy's gayness for laughs quite a bit. I mean, there's one where he's handing around the, you know, food at one of the many funerals, I think, saying, you know, these are to die for. And when they first arrive, he makes a remark like that, and one of the women says, "Well, would you get a load of that Liberati's just moved?"
Yeah.
That line you read, I must say, I didn't quite like the one about, you know, she's never worked a day in her life, she's too good looking to that. But his refusal to give up, the fact that he'd do anything for her all the time, is unwavering faith that maybe it'll all if he could just love her enough, it'll all be okay.
Mm.
I did find quite believable and also really heartbreaking. I mean, he loves her. That's the thing. That's the thing he's stuck with.
We are doing this for Burns Night, so I do kind of actually talk about this in a kind of Scottish literary tradition. And James, in your New York Review of Books, you talk a lot about this theory of the double self that runs in the Scottish literary tradition, and the likes of J.M. Barrie or Muriel Spark. Could you tell us more about that?
The New York Review of Books, sent me this book, and it was way pre-Booker. It was a debut book from an unknown writer, as far as I was concerned. And obviously, he's based in New York. And I thought, why they're sending me this? And also for the New York Review of Books, you've got to do basically 3,500 words or something. So you can't do that on one book. A, impossible, and B, way too boring. So the way you'd normally do it is by reading all the other books that the author has written, and then doing it that way. But this is his only book, so I thought I'd look into how it fitted into Scottish literature, and it sort of really does. So a couple of points I'd like to make. There's a book called Scotland's Books by Robert Crawford, which is sort of encyclopedic look at the whole of Scottish literature. And there's one book that he calls The Only Book-Length Account of a Mother by a Male Scottish Writer. So this was obviously that book, Scotland's Books, was written before Shuggie Bain. And what he's referring to is Margaret Ogilvy by J.M. Barrie, about his mother, Margaret Ogilvy. So the tone of that is set in the opening chapter. When you looked into my mother's eyes, Barrie writes, you knew as if he had told you, capital H, why God had sent her into the world. It was to open the minds of all who looked to beautiful thoughts. And the way Barrie tells it, his mother began each day by the fireside with the New Testament in her hands. The rest of it she spent cheerfully performing domestic tasks, mainly sewing, and enjoying the works of George Eliot and Thomas Carlyle, who she would read, quote, entranced for hours. Now,
exemplary woman.
Exactly. And then, so now we've got our second account of a mother by a male Scottish writer, 100 and odd years later. This time a mother whose day is more likely to begin with a blinding hangover, a spot of dry heaving, and an urgent quest for any booze lying around. And should this quest fail, it often does, pops to the liquor store for 12 cans of special brew. And it doesn't read much Eliot or Carlyle as far as we know. So what I was quite interested in is how did Scottish literature get from there to here? And if you bear with me, it is a quite interesting story, really, because there was a thing called the Cale Yard movement, which was the late 19th century, and it was very sentimental tales about sort of Scottish village life. Cale Yard was actually a pejorative term, but it came from Ian McLaren wrote a best-selling collection of rural Scottish tales beside the bonny briar bush. And it has the epigraph, there grows a bonny briar bush in our Cale Yard. So Cale Yard becomes these sentimental tales of lovely Scottishness. And J.M. Barrie was part of that in Margaret Ogilvy. It was much mocked by sort of people in Glasgow and Edinburgh and so on. But it made it it was very, very popular, and not just in Britain or in Scotland. McLaren himself died on his second lecture tour of America, I think, and it was also an influence on Lucy M. Montgomery, wrote Anne of Green Gables. She was very proud of her Scottish heritage. But then came a massive backlash to this. So a book called The House with Green Shutters, written in 1901 by George Douglas Brown. He says, I'm sick of the sentimental slop of Barrie and McLaren. No one pictures real Scottish life. I will write a novel and tell you what Scottish village life is like. And so he writes this ferocious book full of booze and sectarianism, Catholics versus Protestants. The plot is like Thomas Hardy on stilts, suicides, murders. Then there's a reaction to that, I think, which is a book. I wonder how many people have heard of this. This is, in 2016, BBC Scotland did a poll to find what the Scottish public's favourite Scottish book was. And it was also, Nicola Sturgeon has called it, without a shadow of doubt, my favourite book of all time. And it is Sunset Song by Lewis Grassic Gibbon. If it's a book you know about.
I only heard of it in your review.
And this sort of tries to, well, it introduces us to a village called Kinraddy. And Gibbon says in the book that this village is fathered between a Cale Yard and a bonny briar bush in the lee of a house of green shutters, even though there wasn't a house with green shutters in the whole of Kinraddy. So what he's saying here is basically it's neither the soppy Kinraddy, Cale Yard stuff, nor is it the unbelievably ferocious house with green shutters stuff. And the main character in the book, a woman called Chris Guthrie, feels there are two Chris's that fall for her heart and tormented her. You hated the land and the coarse speak of the folk one day, and the next you'd almost cry for the beauty and sweetness of the Scottish land and skies. So you got that double thing, and I think that's that pendulum. So it's classic sort of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and I think Shuggie Bain fits into that. Much as Douglas Stuart says, Glasgow is the place I love best in the world. Can't wait to come home to Glasgow. I love Glasgow. Shuggie Bain has both of those.
Yeah.
A great love for the place, a great hatred of the place. And so it fits in
Yeah,
there.
he says that and goes and lives in New York.
He
Yeah.
does. Well, we can come back to that. If you
We'll
want.
stop beating him up for it.
That idea of a divided self in Scottish writing, I mean, we've talked about this before. I mean, I suppose the most famous example is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which non-readers will know about too. Douglas Stuart himself says, it's there in Muriel Spark. When we talked about Muriel Spark, do you remember her favourite word was nevertheless,
Yeah.
or her favourite idea was nevertheless. This is true. Nevertheless, so is this. Nevertheless, so is this.
Yes.
And Prime Miss Jean Brodie, she's quite divided, and she's both inspiring and destructive, and so on and so on. Douglas Stuart has said that the divided self is massive to him, and obviously it's there in Agnes.
Yes.
So at one point, Eugene has heard from his sister Colleen that she was an alky whore, and now she's this lovely, and now that she's this lovely woman, and he says, "I can't believe that you and her are the same person."
Yeah.
And then Douglas Stuart himself said that he wrote the book in a way because of his own divided self. So here he is, this high-flying, pretty wealthy fashion designer living in Manhattan with his husband, and yet his background is cleaning up after his mother and cleaning up her vomit and so on. And he felt completely divided, and the way to bring it together was by writing this book.
Yes.
So that's a fairly lengthy answer to your question.
I think it's beautiful, actually, and like really topical for today.
Joe, and I know you obviously got more reservations about the book than I have, and I believe that one of them is something actually that Douglas Stuart addresses in various interviews, that he has been accused of basically leading sort of middle-class readers on a poverty safari, poverty tourism.
Safari is so much worse than tourism.
Safari is the word he used, actually, but poverty tourism is the normal thing. Do you want to make a case for why that you at least think that might be a slight worry?
Well, in a conversation at the South Bank Centre with Bernardine Evaristo, there's this kind of, I think now quite famous enough to be mentioned on his Wikipedia page, quote, where he says, "One of my biggest regrets, I think, is that growing up so poor, I almost had to elevate myself to the middle class to turn around to tell a working class story." And I'm by no means sort of trying to slate Douglas Stuart here, because I actually think this is a deeper issue that's endemic within the book trade. And I guess this is sort of more of a criticism at the book's reception, because you have sort of swung me around on several points, James. But Stuart himself has said that when the book got sent out on acquisition, just the kind of literary jargon, to be bought, I guess, or acquired, he got back a lot of very long, beautiful letters from publishers saying, "It's a beautiful book, it's a wonderful book, but we have no idea how to market it, so we're going to pass." That's a very famous phrase if you're getting a rejection letter from a publisher, "We're going to pass." I hate that euphemism.
Also, it's really, really great, but no thank you.
Yeah. And I do slightly worry, and it is kind of connected to these questions I had about how deeply or to what extent this book actually engages in a kind of true sociopolitical portrait of Glasgow, and to what extent it's sort of a much more kind of emotional, kind of, potentially nostalgia driven text. I do worry the big kind of focus over the last 5 or 6 years in publishing has been to create a kind of diversity of voices, but often this has meant that whenever a so-called marginalised or diverse voice, be they sort of people of colour or working class writers, have been spotlighted, it is only for their suffering. And there is sort of this idea of, we've got to read about these poor people. It's just wretched, isn't it? Look at all this poor scum in Glasgow, is alcoholic, and I cried at the end of it, and I feel enlightened because I cried. Something about
the bottle
that.
of Chardonnay, please.
Yeah, something about that response does actually repel me quite deeply.
Okay, fair dues. Except that's that response. That's not the book.
No, that's not the book.
That's not his fault. I really think that. So he said. In response to that, he said, "I've been accused of sort of poverty touring, poverty safari, but what about the people who lived it? I've got to tell the story."
I'm not disagreeing with you, and like I said, I don't think this is down to Douglas Stuart himself, because he was edited and jacketed and marketed and publicised in a certain way. It's not him, but I do sort of wonder partially like how that ties into, you know, my desire for a kind of more well-rounded sketch of the kind of class influences within the community that Agnes lives in. And then also partially to, I guess, you know, you said yourself, Douglas Stuart has kind of gone along with this idea of it being a beautiful sentimental portrait of his poor addled mother, and I would really like to see him do an interview that breaks from, and I mean, all authors have stock phrases. I've used stock phrases to publicize my work, but I kind of found myself like trying to find an interview where the interviewer had managed to like jolt him out of it and get him to talk a bit more sort of sharply about the book, you know, with the sort of like really deep frustration that it sometimes made me feel, you know.
And I think the deep frustration and anger that you maybe would like him to feel towards his mother or something is there in the book.
Yeah,
it's quite
but
difficult
I want
to do in
him
real.
to talk about
but,
it.
but maybe he can't, or maybe he doesn't want to.
Yeah, that's fair. Maybe I'm asking too much of poor Douglas Stuart.
So, Joe, you still clearly have reservations about this enormously well-loved book. But do you understand why it's enormously well-loved?
No, I understood it the moment I read it. You've won me round a lot more than when I finished the last sentence, and I don't want to.
Yeah, it's normally the other way around. You normally.
Yeah, I don't want to spoil the end at all. I think a lot of my frustration with the book is with the final scene between Shuggy and his mother, which I think sort of eliminates most of the premise of this book.
Oh, I love that too. Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. That's fine. But I feel much more warmly towards it after having spoken to you, James.
Well, again, I would suggest it's a far less cuddly book than the popular myth might now suggest. So that's it for our Burns Night Shuggie Bain.
Yeah, and if you are on a Scottish kick, we do have others. You can listen to our episodes on Loitering with Intent by Muriel Spark and our interview with Graham McRae Burnett about his bloody project.
Another divided self right there.
Yeah.
To find out more about Shuggie Bain, including a video in which Douglas Stuart is interviewed by none other than Queen Camilla, go to thebookerprizes.com.
And you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok and Substack at The Booker Prizes, as well as joining our book group on Facebook.
See you next week.
Bye. The Booker Prize podcast is hosted by me, Jo Hamier, and by James Walton. It is produced and edited by Kevin Moyolo, and the executive producer is John Davenport. It is a Daddy's Super Yacht production for the Booker Prizes.